Injuries in Professional Rugby League. Brisbane Broncos Rugby League Football Club, Queensland, Australia. Skip the abstract. Introduction. Rugby league is a team sport played in several countries worldwide. A typical senior rugby league match is 80 minutes in duration with frequent intense bouts of running and tackling, interspersed with short bouts of recovery. Hence, rugby league is a physically demanding game that requires players to draw upon a variety of physical qualities, including muscular strength, power, endurance, speed, skill, and agility. Because of the complex nature of the sport, the application of periodized, game-specific conditioning drills poses a considerable challenge to the rugby league conditioning coach. Studies of team sport athletes have consistently shown higher skilled players to possess superior speed, muscular power, and maximal aerobic power compared to lesser skilled players. Similarly, in the team sport environment, significant expert-novice differences have been demonstrated in pattern recognition, decision-making, dual task performance, and anticipation. Given the importance of these physiological and skill qualities to team sport performance, coaches have great interest in finding the most effective methods of developing these traits in their athletes. Game-based training is increasingly being used as a means of improving the skill and physical fitness levels of team sport athletes, and their utility as training drills has recently been successfully applied to rugby league. Game-based training allows the simulation of movement patterns required for rugby league while maintaining a competitive environment where athletes must perform under pressure and while fatigued. Perhaps more importantly, game-based training offers an additional challenge to team sport athletes that would not normally be present in non-skill related conditioning activities. To date, few studies have investigated the incidence of injury in game-based training. In a study of semi-professional rugby league players, it was found that the majority of training injuries per 1,000 hours, 37.5%, were sustained in traditional conditioning activities that involved no skill component, i.e. running without a ball, whereas the incidence of injuries in game-based training was relatively low. Per 1,000 training hours, 10.7%. These findings have been confirmed in a subsequent study that showed a low incidence of injury in game-based training, 20.7 per 1,000 training hours, in relation to traditional conditioning activities, running without the ball, 40.3 per 1,000 training hours, in amateur rugby league players. Despite the growing evidence that game-based training offers a safe and effective method of conditioning for team sport athletes, there is still resistance among the strength and conditioning fraternity to use games as a conditioning tool. In addition, all studies to date have involved sub-light athletes, thereby limiting the generalizability to elite competitors. With this in mind, the purpose of this study was to investigate the incidence, site, and nature of training injuries in professional rugby league players and to identify the training activities that were associated with the highest rates of injury in these athletes. Methods. Experimental approach to the problem. The present study used a prospective environmental design to identify the training activities that were associated with the highest rates of injury in rugby league players. Based on previous evidence, it was hypothesized that game-based training would be associated with lower injury rates than other traditional conditioning activities. A single recorder assessed all injuries, with lost training time documented and injuries adjusted for exposure. The injury definition used in the present study was identical to that used in previous studies, and the experimental design and methodology used in the present study were consistent with those recently recommended for the study of sport injuries incidents. Subjects. The incident, site, nature, cause, and severity of training injuries were prospectively studied in 35 professional rugby league players over an entire pre-competitive and competitive season. Training began in November 2007, and the competition period finished in September 2008. The mean, plus or minus SD, age, height, and body mass of subjects were 23.7 plus or minus 3.8 years, 183.2 plus or minus 4.9 centimeters, 94.4 plus or minus 9.2 kilograms respectively. All subjects were highly motivated players from the same professional rugby league club, were competing in the elite National Rugby League competition and were free from injury at the commencement of the study. All participants received a clear explanation of the study and written consent was obtained. The Institutional Review Board for Human Investigation approved all experimental procedures. Training sessions. Each player participated in up to 9 supervised strength and field training sessions per week. Players were assigned to one of 3 positional groups: hit, up, forwards, adjustables, or outside backs. Training for these groups differed relative to specific on-field skills and physiological demands. All coaching staff provided input into the design and content of training sessions. The content of the session was based on perceived strengths and weaknesses within the club and within individual players. The training session consisted of specific skills, speed, muscular power, agility, and endurance. Training common to rugby league. Skill sessions were designed to develop passing, catching, and ball carrying technique, tackling technique, support play, defensive line speed and shape, and ball control. Although some differences existed in the intensity of the activities performed throughout the session, the types of activities performed in the preseason training phase, basic skills, light and full contact tackling drills, and longer interval running, were similar to the early competition and late competition training phase, light contact tackling drills, advanced skills, and shorter repeated sprint training. The duration of the training session was recorded, with the sessions typically lasting between 60 and 100 minutes, as outlined in the training plan for the season is shown in Table 1. Definition of injury. For the purpose of the study, an injury was defined as any pain or disability suffered by a player during training session. All injuries were diagnosed by the club physiotherapist and were classified as a transient, no training missed, minor, up to 7 days missed, moderate, 8 to 28 days missed, or major, 29 days or greater missed. In addition, injuries were classified according to the site, type, and activity at the time of injury. Statistical analysis. Injury exposure was calculated by multiplying the number of players by the session duration. Assumed equal exposure for all players. Injury incidence was calculated by dividing the total number of injuries by the overall injury exposure and the expressed as rates per 1,000 training hours and 95% confidence intervals, CIs. Results. Incidence and severity of injury. Injury data were collected from 216 training sessions, which included all preseason and in-season strength and conditioning and game-based training sessions. The total injury exposure over the season was 6,093.5 hours. During the season, a total of 126 training injuries were recorded, giving an overall incidence of injury of 20.7, 95% CI, 17.1 through 24.3 per 1,000 training hours. Almost half, 46%, of all injuries sustained resulted in missed training time. The incidence of injury resulting in missed training days was 9.5, 95% CI, 7.1 through 12.0 per 1,000 training hours. Table 2. Site of injury. The thigh was the most common site of injury, with twice as many posterior thigh injuries, 95 CI, 2.5 through 5.7 per 1,000 training hours, 19.8%, as anterior thigh injuries, 95% CI, 0.9 through 3.1 per 1,000 training hours, 9.5%. Injuries to the ankle and foot, 95% CI, 1.8 through 4.7 per 1,000 training hours, 15.9%. Calf, 95 CI, 1.6 through 4.3 per 1,000 training hours, 14.3%, and knee, 95 CI, 1.1 through 3.5 per 1,000 training hours, 11.1%, were less common. Table 3. Type of injuries. The type of injuries sustained is shown in Table 4. Hematomas, 95 CI, 4.5 through 8.6 per 1,000 training hours, 31.8%, and muscular strains, 2.9 through 6.3 per 1,000 training hours, 22.2%, were the most common type of injury, whereas joint sprains, 1.1 through 3.5 per 1,000 training hours, 11.1%, and contusions, 0.3 through 2.0 per 1,000 training hours, 5.6%, were less common. Activity at the time of injury. The activity at the time of injury is shown in Table 5. The majority of injuries, 27.2 through 49.7 per 1,000 training hours, 35.7%, were sustained in traditional conditioning activities that involve no skill component, running without the ball. In contrast, the incidence of injuries sustained while participating in strength, 1.5 through 7.4 per 1,000 training hours, 7.1%, and game-based training activities, 3.3 through 9.1 per 1,000 training hours, 14.3%, was low. Other injuries that resulted in lost training time, 1/3 were sustained in traditional conditioning activities, 9.6 through 24.6 per 1,000 training hours, 34.5. The only major injuries, 2, sustained during the season occurred in traditional conditioning activities and speed drills. Injuries sustained during game-based training that resulted in loss of training time was less common, 1.1 through 5.1 per 1,000 training hours, 15.5%. Month of injury. The highest incidence of injury occurred in November, 4.6 through 70.5 per 1,000 training hours, which coincided with the beginning of the preseason training. The incidence of injury was higher in the early stages of the season, 20.5 through 32.0 per 1,000 training hours, than in the latter stages of the season, 10.7 through 19.5 per 1,000 training hours, Table 6. Discussion. This study is the first to investigate the incidence of training injuries in professional rugby league players and identify the training activities that were associated with the highest rates of injury in these athletes. The results of this study confirmed and extend those from amateur and semi-professional rugby league players by demonstrating that traditional conditioning activities, running activities without the ball, are also associated with the highest incidence of injury in professional rugby league players. In addition, of the injuries that resulted in lost training time, 1/3 were sustained in traditional conditioning activities. In contrast, the incidence of severity of injuries in game-based training was low. Previous studies have demonstrated that game-based training effectively stimulates the physiological demands of competition, which also resulting in similar and in some cases greater improvements in physical fitness and skill as traditional coaching techniques. Given the low incidence of injury in game-based activities and the added skill and physical benefits associated with this form of training, strength and conditioning coaches should consider using appropriate designed game-based training activities as a physical conditioning tool in professional rugby league players. The thigh, particularly the posterior thigh, was the most common site of injury. These findings may be expected given that over 45% of all injuries occurred in either traditional running activities or speed drills. In addition, a significant proportion, 22.2% of those injuries, were muscular strains, suggesting that either the intensity, volume, or frequency of speed and conditioning activities prescribed during the season was greater than can be tolerated by the musculoskeletal system. However, although the vast majority of thigh injuries were muscular strains that occurred in traditional conditioning and speed activities, it should be recognized that absolute speed is a critical physical quality that distinguishes elite and sub-elite team sport athletes. Consequently, effective training of this quality may invariably result in some injuries. The obvious challenge for strength and conditioning coaches is to develop training programs that take into account the current physical competencies of athletes and further develop these qualities while minimizing the risk of injury. An interesting finding from the present study was the low incidence of injury in strength conditioning activities. These findings support the notion that appropriately supervised resistance training programs offer a safe form of training for professional rugby league players. In addition, although game-based training resulted in relatively few injuries, hematomas were common. Game-based training activities require players to compete in open skill activities involving tackling and physical collisions. It is therefore not surprising to find a high incidence of hematomas within the present cohort of professional rugby league players. Although hematomas were common, only one of these hematomas that occurred in game-based training resulted in missed training time. The incidence of injury was highest in the early stage of the season. These findings are consistent with the previous rugby league studies that have demonstrated higher rates of injury during the preseason training period, when training loads are typically at their highest. Furthermore, others have reported a significant positive relationship between training loads and the incidence of injury in amateur and semi-professional rugby league players. To date, no study has investigated the relationship between training loads and injury incidence in professional rugby league players. Given the importance of well-developed physical qualities to performance, studies investigating the relationship between training load and injury in professional rugby league players are clearly warranted. In summary, this study investigated the incidence of training injuries in professional rugby league players and identified the training activities that were associated with the highest rates of injury in these athletes. The results of the study demonstrate that traditional conditioning activities, running activities without the ball, are associated with the highest incidence of injury in professional rugby league players. In contrast, the incidence of injuries in game-based training is low. Given the low incidence of injury in game-based activities and the added skill and physical benefits associated with this form of training, strength and conditioning coaches should consider using appropriately designed game-based training activities as a physical conditioning tool in professional rugby league players. Practical applications. There are several applications of this study that are relevant to the strength and conditioning coach. Firstly, effective injury prevention is dependent on the identification of this extent of the injury problem and the causes of those injuries. Without knowledge of the training activities that are responsible for injury, it is impossible to reduce the incidence of injury. The present study demonstrates the training activities associated with a high risk of injury, traditional conditioning activities that involve no skill component, and those that are associated with a relatively low risk of injury, game-based training. Secondly, it has been documented that game-based training effectively simulates the physiological demands of competition, while also resulting in similar and in some cases greater improvements in physical fitness and skill as traditional coaching techniques. Given the low incidence of injury in game-based activities and the added skill of physical benefits associated with this form of training, strength and conditioning coaches should consider using appropriately designed game-based training activities as a physical conditioning tool in professional rugby league players. Finally, injuries were more common in the early stages of the season than in the latter stages of the season. Although there are several possible explanations for this finding, these results may suggest that poor fitness in combination with high training loads in this training period may unduly increase the risk of injury. Indeed, poor preseason aerobic fitness and speed coupled with high training loads have been shown to increase the risk of injury in sub-elite rugby league players. These studies highlight the importance of players returning from their off-season break maintaining a minimum standard of fitness and strength and conditioning. Coaches ensuring training loads are gradually increased during the initial stages of preseason training.